February 14, 1945. San Francisco Harbor, California. The stretcher tilted as they carried her down the frozen gangway. Yuki Tanaka tried to lift her hands, but they wouldn't move. The rags wrapped around her fingers had frozen solid during the night. When the American medic unwrapped them in the ambulance, he went silent. Her fingers were black from the knuckles to the tips. All 10 of them dead. If you're watching from Japan, the United States, or anywhere across the world, take a moment to hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. These untold stories from World War II reveal humanity at its most tested and most transcendent. Your support ensures these voices aren't forgotten. Now let's continue with a story that will challenge everything you thought you knew about enemies and mercy. Yuki closed her eyes and waited for what the propaganda had promised. The Americans would let her die. They would laugh at her suffering. They were barbarians, incapable of compassion for a Japanese woman. But when she opened her eyes again, the medic was wrapping her hands in clean white bandages, his touch impossibly gentle. And behind him, through the ambulance window, she saw something that shattered every certainty she had ever held. The city was whole, untouched, gleaming in winter sunlight. America had never been bombed, and in that moment, lying in an enemy ambulance with dying hands, Yuki Tanaka realized that everything she had been taught was a lie. The journey to this moment had begun 3 months earlier in the Philippines. Yuki had served as a nurse's aide at a field hospital outside Manila, part of the small contingent of Japanese women who supported the Imperial Army in non-combat roles. She changed bandages, held the hands of dying soldiers, and tried not to think too deeply about the war consuming the Pacific. When the Americans broke through in January 1945, the hospital was overrun in hours. Yuki and 17 other women were captured, processed, and loaded onto a transport ship bound for the United States. The crossing took 4 weeks through the worst winter storms the Pacific had seen in years. The women were kept in a converted cargo hold, given thin blankets and watery soup twice a day. The propaganda had prepared them for worse. They had been told Americans would torture prisoners, that Japanese women would be violated and murdered. Instead, they were simply cold, miserably, bone-achingly cold. When the ship's heating system failed somewhere, mid-ocean, the temperature in their hold dropped below freezing for 3 straight days. The women huddled together, sharing what warmth their bodies could generate, whispering prayers to ancestors who felt impossibly far away. Yuki felt her fingers go numb on the 2nd day. By the 3rd, they had turned white. She knew what this meant. She had seen frostbite in soldiers stationed in Manchuria, had watched field surgeons amputate blackened fingers with the casual efficiency of men who had performed the procedure 100 times. She wrapped her hands in torn fabric from her uniform and tried to accept what was coming. At 23 years old, she would lose her fingers, perhaps her hands entirely, perhaps her life. The ship had no doctor, no medical supplies beyond basic bandages. She was alone with her dying flesh, surrounded by women who could do nothing but offer prayers that felt increasingly hollow. When the ship finally docked in San Francisco, Yuki could no longer feel anything below her wrists. The morning was bright and cold, the kind of cold that came from clear skies rather than storm clouds. American soldiers lined a pier, their uniforms clean, their faces showing curiosity rather than hatred. Yuki tried to walk down the gangway, but her legs wouldn't hold her. 2 medics lifted her onto a stretcher with a gentleness that confused her. One of them, a young man with red hair and freckles, smiled at her. Actually smiled, as if she were not the enemy, as if her suffering mattered. The ambulance ride through San Francisco streets felt like traveling through a dream. Buildings stood intact, windows unbroken, paint fresh. People walked freely, carrying shopping bags, laughing, living normal lives. No bomb craters, no burned-out shells, no skeletal remains of neighborhoods consumed by firestorms. Yuki pressed her face to the ambulance window and stared. Japan had been told that America was suffering, that their cities were devastated, that their people were broken. But here was San Francisco, gleaming and whole, and utterly untouched by war. The lie was so vast it took her breath away. The hospital rose white against the California hills, larger than any building Yuki had seen since leaving Osaka. The warmth hit her when they wheeled her inside, a physical wall of heat that made her gasp. For weeks she had known only cold. Now warmth surrounded her, seeped into her bones, and she began to shake uncontrollably. They brought her to a room with 2 beds, both empty, both made with sheets so white they seemed to glow, A window looked out on a garden where bare trees waited for spring. A radiator clicked and hummed, pouring out heat like forgiveness. A nurse came to unwrap the rags from Yuki's hands. The fabric had frozen to her skin and had to be soaked in warm water before it would release. When the last layer fell away, Yuki forced herself to look. Her fingers were black from the second knuckle to the tips. The flesh had the texture of old leather, hard and lifeless. The nails were separating from the nail beds. She had seen this before in soldiers. She knew what it meant. Amputation was inevitable. All 10 fingers would be removed. She would spend the rest of her life without hands. The nurse made a small sound, not of disgust but of sympathy, and immediately left to find a doctor. Yuki lay staring at her ruined hands, thinking of all the things she would never do again. Write letters, fold origami cranes for her little sister, hold chopsticks, button her own clothes. She had accepted death on the transport ship. Somehow losing her hands felt worse. The doctor, who entered an hour later, was tall, with gray at his temples and eyes that seemed to see through surfaces into deeper structures. He introduced himself through a Japanese-American interpreter named Margaret. His name was Dr. William Chen. He was a specialist in reconstructive surgery, trained at Johns Hopkins and Massachusetts General. He had spent the last decade developing techniques to save limbs that other surgeons considered hopeless. He took Yuki's hands in his own and examined them with the intensity of a man reading sacred text. Dr. Chen asked questions through Margaret. How long had the fingers been frozen? Had there been any warming and refreezing? Any previous injuries? Yuki answered mechanically, her voice flat. What did it matter? Dead tissue was dead tissue. But Dr. Chen kept examining, pressing gently, making notes in a file. Finally, he looked at her directly and said something that Margaret translated with obvious surprise in her voice. He thinks he can save some of your fingers, not all of them, but some. He wants to try a new technique. But you must understand the risks. Yuki stared at him. Save her fingers. This American doctor wanted to save the hands of an enemy prisoner. It made no sense. Traditional treatment for frostbite this severe was immediate amputation. Remove the dead tissue before infection spread. That was the only option. That was what every military surgeon would do. But Dr. Chen was talking about multiple surgeries, weeks of specialized care, experimental treatments that might fail. Why would he do this? Why would America devote such resources to saving the hands of one Japanese woman? She asked Margaret to translate her question. The interpreter spoke to Dr. Chen, who paused before answering. His reply came slowly, carefully, each word chosen with precision. Because healing is what I do. Because your fingers have no flag. Because cruelty does not cure cruelty. The answer lodged in Yuki's mind like a seed waiting for soil. The first surgery came 3 days later. Dr. Chen and his team worked for 5 hours, carefully removing tissue that was truly dead while preserving everything that might possibly survive. Yuki was unconscious for the procedure, drifting in anesthetic darkness. When she woke, her hands were wrapped in fresh white bandages. The room was filled with evening light. Her hands throbbed with dull pain that somehow felt like hope. The days developed a rhythm that felt surreal. Each morning, a nurse would unwrap the bandages and soak Yuki's hands in warm solution, designed to promote blood flow. Each afternoon, Dr. Chen would examine the tissue, making notes, adjusting treatments. Speaking in medical terminology that Margaret struggled to translate, each evening, Yuki would lie awake, staring at her bandaged hands, trying to understand what was happening to her. The food continued to astonish her. Breakfast brought eggs, cooked in butter, bacon, toast with jam, orange juice that tasted like sunshine. Lunch offered sandwiches thick with meat, soup with actual vegetables, fruit she hadn't seen in years. Dinner was even more elaborate. Roasted chicken. The portions were so generous they would have fed her entire family in Osaka for days. She ate slowly, her stomach protesting against abundance after months of near-starvation rations. One nurse, an older woman named Betty with kind eyes and gray hair, began bringing extra portions. She would set them on Yuki's tray with a wink, as if they shared a secret that transcended language and nationality. Betty learned to say good morning in Japanese, practicing until her pronunciation made Yuki smile instead of wince. These small acts of kindness accumulated like stones building a wall around something Yuki had thought was dead. Hope, fragile and terrifying, but real. Letters arrived through Red Cross channels. Her mother wrote that Osaka had been bombed, but they had survived. They were hungry, but alive. They prayed for Yuki's return. Her younger sister added a note about working in a factory making airplane parts, about her pride in serving the emperor, about her certainty that Japan would still win. Reading these words in her American hospital bed, surrounded by American kindness, eating American food, Yuki felt torn in two. Part of her wanted to believe what her sister believed, but another part, growing larger each day, could no longer sustain the belief. The other Japanese prisoners at the hospital gathered sometimes in a common room, a handful of wounded soldiers, a few civilian women like Yuki. They spoke in hushed Japanese, sharing their confusion. How can they treat us this way? What do they want from us? Why does kindness feel more dangerous than cruelty? Some insisted that acceptance meant betrayal, that American kindness was psychological warfare. Others spoke openly about shattered beliefs, about propaganda proven false. The arguments grew heated until a nurse would appear and they would fall silent. Reminded that they were still prisoners, still enemies, but the conversations always resumed. The questions always returned, because they had nowhere else to put the confusion filling them. The second surgery came in early March. Dr. Chen was able to save more than he had hoped. The thumb on Yuki's right hand was gone, amputated cleanly at the base. But the other fingers on that hand showed signs of recovery, pink returning to gray tissue, sensation flickering back in nerves everyone had expected to be dead. Her left hand was even better. All 5 digits remained attached, though 2 were still uncertain. Dr. Chen told her through Margaret that her body was fighting alongside them, that they were winning. His eyes held satisfaction that seemed almost fierce. This was personal to him, Yuki realized. Not just medical interest, but something deeper. He cared whether her fingers survived. This enemy doctor genuinely cared about the hands of an enemy woman. Meanwhile, news from the Pacific grew darker. American bombers were hitting Japanese cities with increasing frequency. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya. The radio in Yuki's room carried reports of hundreds of thousands dead, millions homeless. She thought of her mother and sister, wondered if they were still alive, wondered if they would ever know what had become of her. The Americans were destroying her homeland while saving her hands. The contradiction should have bred hatred. Instead, it bred vertigo, a moral confusion so complete she could find no solid ground. She asked Dr. Chen through Margaret, "Why do you heal me while your country burns mine?" He paused before answering, his face thoughtful. "Because healing is what I do. Because your fingers have no flag. Because cruelty does not cure cruelty." The same answer he had given before, but this time Yuki heard it differently. This time she understood that he meant it literally, that for him there was no contradiction. Healing was healing. The body did not carry a passport. Spring arrived gradually. Cherry blossoms bloomed on a tree near the hospital entrance. When Yuki saw them, she felt recognition so intense it took her breath away. Cherry blossoms in America, the symbol of Japan growing freely in enemy soil. Margaret arranged for her to sit in the garden one afternoon, wheeled out to feel sun and smell blossoms. Yuki sat for an hour, her healing hands resting in her lap, her face turned toward petals drifting down like pink snow. A gardener working nearby noticed her attention and came over. He spoke through Margaret, explaining that he had planted the tree years ago because his wife loved Japanese art. He had kept it through the war because beauty should not be punished for the actions of nations. Yuki thanked him in English, one of the few phrases she had learned. The gardener smiled as if he had received a precious gift. The defining moment came in early May, during what was supposed to be a routine examination. Dr. Chen unwrapped Yuki's bandages with his usual care, but as the gauze fell away, his expression changed. He leaned closer, examined her left hand with particular intensity, then looked up with something like wonder in his eyes. He called for other doctors who came and examined her hand with similar amazement. Later, when Margaret arrived, she explained what had happened. "Your fingers have fully recovered. All 5 on your left hand have regained blood flow and sensation. Dr. Chen says it is the best result he has ever achieved with frostbite this severe. He is calling it a miracle." Yuki looked at her left hand, flexed the fingers that had been black and dead 3 months ago. Something broke open inside her. She wept then, deep sobs that shook her entire body. Release of fear and gratitude and confusion mixed into something she could not name. Dr. Chen held her while she cried. This enemy doctor holding his enemy patient while she wept for joy at the miracle they had made together. Her right hand had suffered terribly, yet not as badly as the doctors first feared. The thumb was lost, the pinky shortened, but 3 fingers survived, scarred, shorter, functional. Dr. Chen presented this as a triumph, and medically it was. "You will be able to write," he told her through Margaret. "You will be able to hold things, to work, to live." That evening, Yuki studied both hands in the fading light. The left looked almost normal. The right was irrevocably altered, a landscape reshaped by injury and mercy. These were the hands of someone who had nearly lost everything, saved by those she had been taught to hate. Flexing them, she felt the miracle of sensation in tissue once dead, and she understood she was no longer the girl who had boarded the transport in the Philippines. That Yuki believed in simple truths and clear enemies. This Yuki knew that the enemy had shown her humanity and had therefore stopped being enemy. The war's end came in August with news that felt both unreal and inevitable. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, surrender. In the hospital common room, Japanese prisoners wept for shame, relief, exhaustion. Yuki wept for all of that, and for the loss of the certainty that had once shaped her world. Dr. Chen said goodbye on her last day. She wept again, grasping his hands with her rebuilt fingers, unable to express her gratitude. "Use them well," he told her. Returning home, she saw Japan's coastline shattered harbors in ruin, cities flattened. American bombs had done this, the same Americans who had saved her hands. The contradiction pressed on her chest like a physical weight. Finding her family took days. They embraced in rubble, her mother fragile as paper. Her mother asked about her hands, but Yuki could not reconcile American kindness with American destruction, and gave only the simplest answer. Years passed, Japan rebuilt with desperate determination. Yuki worked as a clerk, married Takeshi, raised children. Only when they were older did she tell them the full story of her hands. When her daughter asked whether she had forgiven America, Yuki answered honestly. Forgiveness was not an event, but a practice. She had not forgiven the bombs, but she had forgiven a man. Decades later came a letter. Dr. Chen had died. His daughter wanted to know if his work had mattered. Yuki wrote back, telling her that her father's kindness had shaped a lifetime. Her hands became more than hands. They became proof that mercy can exist, even in war. As she told her granddaughter beneath drifting cherry blossoms, hatred had been easy, but her hands would not let her hate. Now, she felt only gratitude and wonder.